Recently, I had the privilege of hearing one of your lectures here locally, so we live in the same town. You said, Tim Keller is dead, and we are now in a situation where it doesn't necessarily matter what the people in the past would have done. We have to figure out what we're going to do now. And I thought that just stuck with me. There's so many people who call on people from the past to try to figure out answers to the future. But at some point, you have to pick up the mantle and you have to take on the baton.
Ronald Reagan, people like to think back about Ronald Reagan or think about these sort of titans, John Stott or J.I. Packer, people like that were these great kind of titans of the faith or of other things. And as long as they're around, we're looking to them as these sort of patriarchal figures to tell us what to do, right? It's sort of like we're telling us what to do. And then all of a sudden they're not here anymore. And it's like, we're on stage now. I haven't experienced this yet myself, but I've heard from other people that there's this huge event that happens in a man's life when his father dies. And, even people who are older than me, and who've been living, fully independent adult lives for a long time, it's like, my dad has died. Now I don't have a net. There's no one to call, right? My parents are gone. It's just me. And I think we've all got this idea that we can always, even I do it today. Like if my dad knows a lot of things, often it's practical things like about how, house stuff. I'm like, can you tell me, what to do about this or what to do about that? And all of a sudden you don't have anybody to tell you that anymore. And so I think a lot of times we want to create a hologram of people from the past. And, we had to realize at some point, you're on stage now. And I think that becomes something where we, obviously we can continue looking at what people did and their models, and we can learn from the past, obviously. But, the generational turnover does happen. And the new generations cannot just simply sit on the inheritance of the past. They have to continuously regenerate that, just like we have to keep rebuilding the highways that people built a long time ago. And hopefully we're building something that will continue to expand the legacy and build the stock of capital for the next generation.
Do you think it comes out of just extreme anxiety of that there's so much going on that no one knows really where to start? There's AI, there's political strife, there's interdenomination division, and it just seems that everything is spreading like a spider web in so many different directions that no one knows how to capture it? Or do you think it's just like the previous generation not giving some of the responsibility to the younger generation, so they just don't even know how to lead? There's not too many mentorship programs anymore. There's not older men taking on younger men. And so do you think it's kind of a leadership problem, or do you think it's just like a culture it's too big? Like we don't even know where to start with the problem.
I think there's a lot going on with that. Human beings are not comfortable with uncertainty. And, especially in our kind of world today, where we've had such a technologically sophisticated world where it seems like we can control everything. And, there's an app for that. And then something comes along and it exposes that we don't really have as much control over our world as we think. Even 100 years ago, you could skin your knee and die from an infection. I had a great uncle that I never knew existed. That happened to him. He was like 3 or 4 years old. He fell and skinned his knees and he died. A little kid died. And so that was my grandmother's brother. And then she had another brother that I knew, but I didn't realize kids died and kids still die. But, when something like infant mortality's gone down a lot, we don't even have as much crazy economic uncertainty. We could predict the weather, now in ways we used to not be able to. When we get into a situation where maybe something like AI or COVID or something comes in, we don't know what to do because we're not used to dealing in uncertainty and unpredictable events. That's why I really like the work of Nassim Taleb. He's the former options trader who is famous for his book, The Black Swan. And he's really about how to live life under conditions of uncertainty. And although he writes everything from a very mathematical, secular perspective, A lot of his writing, if you could recapitulate it in a Christian lens, I think very well. When you trust in the Lord, and walking by faith and not by sight, for example, and facing long odds or whatever, but maintaining faith. There's a lot that comes in that. I do think there's been a scenario in which the baby boomers have really been dominant in American life for a very long time. This was a huge generation, and maybe the first generation that I'm aware of where society had to adapt to them. They didn't have to adapt to society. The original generation gap was between the boomers and their parents, and they sort of rejected many of the things that they inherited, such as through the 1960s upheavals and things like that. Now, not entirely. We're not hearing the Minority Report there. And but really the world was very boomer-centric in a way that it was sort of millennial-centric for a while, but to a far greater extent. And, boomers managed to get positions of authority in society at I shouldn't say very early age, but actually at a relatively early age. The example I like to give, there's a lot of examples. One of them is Al Mohler. Al Mohler, I believe, was 33 years old when he became the president of Southern Seminary. If Southern were picking a president today, it is almost inconceivable that they would pick a 33-year-old. Or that 33-year-old, if they hired a 33-year-old, would not have the ability to come in and completely reshape the institution the way that Mohler was. He's like, well, I'm going to completely change over the staff, the faculty, the way we're doing business here. So a guy like that got power. If you think about even Generation X, the next guy, the highest performing guy I can think of in terms of like achievement level of Generation X Southern Baptists in kind of the institutional world was Russell Moore. Russell Moore, I think, was 41 when he became the head of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is a much less well-funded, less prominent institution than, say, Southern Seminary. And so there was a delta. These guys got kind of pretty early access to real authority. So Bill Clinton was the third youngest person ever elected president and of course the first baby boomer president. And Clinton, George W. Bush, and Donald Trump were all born within a few months of each other in 1946. So we've had like tremendous dominance of society of the baby boomer generations for a long time. It really has still been a baby boomer world. And so there hasn't been total generational turnover maybe in the way that there would have been. And I think some of it's just accidents of fate. Think about a guy like Prince Charles. He's born and he's the crown prince at a very early age, but his mom lives forever. Queen Elizabeth just went on and on and on. And like this guy is now, I don't know how old he is. He must be in his late 70s at a minimum. And he finally becomes king. And it's like, oh man, I waited my entire life for this. And even the baby boomers, I don't know that he's a baby boomer. I think he's older than a baby boomer, but there's a sense to which even the baby boomers suffered under this because of increasing lifespan. So I think about when I was a kid, we'd always go over to, grandma's house for Christmas. And I think back one of my earliest memories, and we're all going to grandma's house for Christmas. Grandma and grandpa were probably in their 50s. I'm going to guess they were in their mid to late 50s. I thought they were old, but they were probably in their mid to late 50s. But my grandmother lived to be 99 years old. And so, her children, like my three aunts, spent their entire adult life still going to their mother's house for Christmas. We went to grandma's house for Christmas until my aunts, they did not get to be grandma until they were in their late 70s or in their 70s because their own mother just lived so long. So some of it is like there are accidents of fate. I actually, I think the mentoring question is a complex one. There actually are more kind of official mentoring and leadership programs than there have ever been. there was a huge, and I think about this more from the civic context. There was maybe in the 60s, there was a famous airline crash. Maybe Air France 007 or something. You have to look it up. But a lot of the civic leaders of the city of Atlanta were on that plane and were killed. And so that event and some other events similar created the idea that, wow, we need to be training next generation of leaders. And so now there are tons of leadership development programs. They've really proliferated tremendously since the 1990s. So there's here in Indianapolis, there's Leadership Indianapolis. There's a leadership organization, I think in every county in the state of Indiana. Leadership Indianapolis does, their flagship program is the Stanley K. Lacey Executive Leadership Series. But there's the Mitch Daniels Leadership Foundation. The International Center of Indianapolis does one that sort of focuses on global. The IU Business School has one. There's the political parties run them. I think there's the Lugar series that's for Republican women, and the Democrats have one there. The Indiana Family Institute, which is this mean kind of social conservative outfit in the state, they do the Hoosier Leadership Series. There are like a ton of leadership development programs, but it actually hasn't produced any leadership. And so I think it's a complex issue. I think people thought they were producing leaders, but it really didn't work in a sense. And there was a sense in which the people who were of the boomer generation, who were the greatest leaders, it is true, they didn't really produce a next generation in a sense. So I think about the Lugar series is named after Richard Lugar, who's a former senator from Indiana, former mayor of Indianapolis. Many people consider him kind of the greatest civic leader of modern eras in the state, universally respected he's a Republican, even by Democrats, was very instrumental in Sam Nunn in securing all the post-Soviet nuclear material to make sure that didn't proliferate. Very respected guy. And he was elected mayor of Indianapolis like in his 30s or something. They called him the boy mayor. But he took a group of young people, gave them a lot of leeway to do things, and they became the greatest, cadre of the next generation. So one of them is Mitch Daniels, who became the governor of the state, president of Purdue University, one of the most transformational leaders of his generation. There's a gentleman named Mark Miles who runs the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. He was like a huge civic player here, incredible leader. Another guy named Jim Morris. These are just like incredible Titanic leaders. And you look and you say, what people of the same caliber did they produce under them? And I don't know that they did. Mitch Daniels did not reproduce more Mitch Danielses. And I think it's the same with a lot of these pastors who became, very famous, top-notch people. They didn't produce proteges that have achieved similar stature. But again, I don't think it's entirely for lack of trying. If you think about the succession plans of many of these, elite megachurch pastors, there was an enormously thoughtful processes that went into them. But so many of them blew up and failed. Like the only, real, like the one church that I think has done extremely well with their succession plan to date is actually Saddleback Church. Andy Wood, who took over from Rick Warren there, has done really, really well. But a lot of the other ones ended up quitting or whatever, flaming out. And it's not like the next generation of people produce it. So I do think there's a general perception that there's a leadership crisis in America. And this doesn't just affect the church, it affects everything. And it's one of the things I've studied a lot, but it's a very complicated problem. It's not a simple matter of, these guys sucked. They didn't mentor anybody. I bet if you asked them, they would say, let me tell you all the mentoring I did. Let me tell you all the programs we made. So there were some efforts, but it didn't play out. But I do think, just the size of the cohort of the boomers, how long they've been around, their good health. There certainly has not been like real generational turnover, of a sense.
I see that across everything. So not leadership, but that there's a more abundance in almost anything that you can think of. So social media, we're more connected than we've ever been. We have more mates we can get on social or the dating platforms, and we can be more mates are accessible to us than ever before. Almost anything that you can think of, we are in abundance of. But for some reason, the depth of all of those things seem to not translate. And so even though we have more of something, the depth of it. And so like, even though we have more leadership programs, which is kind of nuts, but I don't know if it's like life on life mentorship, or you just kind of go to a networking event, you hear some guy speak, maybe you do like a little round table, but they don't actually know who you are. They don't know kind of like what you're actually going through, and you can't call them day to day. It's kind of just like a little meeting that you go to. But social media, same thing. You have access to all of your friends that you've ever met in your entire life. Yet I think the average man, right? The average guy my age has 0 to 1 actual true friends that would go help him change a tire in the middle of nowhere type of friendship. And so it feels like it doesn't just translate to leadership, but we have abundance in everything, and it translates to everything that nothing is going deep. And we have a crisis in all kinds of different ways.
Technology is one of the things that does play a role in leadership, in a sense, because now the boss is always connected. So you can always call the boss. I mean, it used to be if the boss was out of town and something came up, you kind of had to make a decision. What if the boss was on a plane to Europe or something, or the boss was on vacation? Maybe you could reach him, but now you can text the boss day or night, any day of the week. And the boss, of course, thinks that they should be making decisions all the time. So there's less, okay, the boss is out of the office or whatever, and something's coming up, and we actually have to make decisions. We have to do things. Now things can be directly, and maybe there wasn't all this real-time data available as well. So today, our technology enables much more comprehensive monitoring, real-time data, and allows relatively few people at the top, or the CEO, to basically make all the decisions directly 24/7. So there was I think it was this, the Archegos collapse. So there was a hedge fund, technically it's a family office, named Archegos, that went belly up, and a bunch of banks lost their collateral because they had been borrowing a bunch of money to trade and things like that. And it was either this or one of them. And so one of the banks that didn't lose any money, the boss was like on vacation in Greece or something like that. He's on the other side of the world. And these people in the office get wind that something's going on. So they call him. And he's like at the hotel or whatever. And he's like, I'm going to go get a drink at the bar. And by the time I get back, I want those positions sold. And of course, so they immediately dumped everything. But like the idea that they had to call the boss, and the boss who's on vacation on the other side of the world made that decision. Now, of course, it was a good decision, but you're not getting the opportunity to do things that would have happened in the past. Everything is so much more bureaucratic today as well, institutionally. There's so many more stakeholders, so much more complexity. I mean, I've written so much on this. We could do like an entire, I could do, podcast after podcast on leadership, and I don't think I've gotten to the bottom of it. But let's just say, I think there's many, many dynamics, and those dynamics are kind of complex.
Let's transition to the church. So this is how I've gotten to know you. You wrote a book. How long would it have been? 3-4 years now?
Well, the book came out last year. It came out in January of 2024, I believe.
Okay.
But it's based on some older work.
Yeah. So you've been having this conversation since 2017.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you have come up with a framework for the church called the positive, neutral, and negative world, tracking back to the 1960s. I want you to break down this framework for us. It has like kind of blown up in the smaller pockets of Christian ministry, missiology, trying to figure out how to navigate. It's very obvious that the culture has shifted. It seems like it's shifting every week. I'd be curious to know if you would update the book with what's been happening of the last year. But yeah, and so the culture is definitely shifting, but people haven't really been able to put language on it. They haven't necessarily been able to pinpoint the splinter. And with your framework, it seems like people are finding some places to put their feet. And so, what is the positive, neutral, and negative world?
Sure. Well, this really is the biggest and most influential thing I ever wrote. Even when I published it in my tiny little newsletter in 2017, it blew up, and is actually the thing that put me on the map originally. It really resonated with people, whatever else. You know, the New York Times did a profile of me earlier this year, and the reporter who did it told me, I decided to do a profile of you because your name comes up more than any other name when I interview evangelicals. So like, that is like crazy to think about. That shows you how much this framework, they're not just talking about me, it's the framework, has become the way, American evangelicals understand the world. And so the basic gist of it is that, unlike Europe, America never had a state church. But for most of our history, we had a sort of softly institutionalized generic Protestantism as our default kind of national religion. So think about as recently as the 1950s. Half of all adults attended church every Sunday. We had prayer and Bible readings in our public schools. We were adding "In God We Trust" to our money and "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, the religiosity, I think, of that era was somewhat shallow, but it was pervasive. It was normative. And that began to go into decline starting in the 1960s. Christianity went, the status of Christianity in America went into a decline that has basically continued to the present day. Church attendance went down, personal adherence went down, Christian morality began to get called into question. And I divide this period of decline from 1964 to the present into three eras or worlds that I call the positive world, the neutral world, and the negative world. So the positive world lasts from 1964 to 1994. And I want to be clear about one thing. This is a period of decline for Christianity. All is not positive in that sense. Church attendance is down, for example. Yet society basically views Christianity positively still. To be known as a good church-going man makes you seem like an upstanding member of society, makes people want to vote for you, makes them want to hire you. Christian morality is still the basic moral standards of society. And if you violate those rules, you get yourself into trouble. 1994, we hit a tipping point and enter the neutral world, which lasts from 1994 to 2014. In the neutral world, Christianity is not seen positively anymore, but it's not really seen negatively yet either. It's just one more lifestyle choice among many in a sort of pluralistic public square. And Christian morality has a residual hold on society. Then in 2014, we hit a second tipping point and enter the negative world, where for the first time in the 400-year history of America, official elite culture now views Christianity negatively, or certainly at least skeptically. Maybe that's a better way to think about it. All throughout our history, many of our people, such as many of our founding fathers, for example, were famously not very much devout. They weren't really believers. But Christianity was publicly held in honor. And that's what's changed today. To be known as a Bible-believing Christian does not help you get a job in the elite domains of society. Christian morality is expressly repudiated and in some ways is viewed as a new threat to the new public moral order. And this shift to a negative world has been very dislocating to American evangelicals who are used to thinking of themselves as a moral majority. The very name of Jerry Falwell's organization, Moral Majority. No one would ever create an organization called like that. Today, we're very much a moral minority. Although, there's a lot, we could talk about this so-called vibe shift, if you want, in the culture.
Yeah, I would love to. And so the thing I'm most fascinated with the cultural vibe shift is that some of the speakers who have attributed to the cultural vibe shift are not themselves Christians. And so that's where I think maybe people are going to maybe watch this and say like negative world, but as of 2025, like Trump, Vance, they're all talking about it. Jordan Peterson is talking about it. As we're filming this podcast, he's actually in a bunch of controversy over something that he just did with Jubilee. But these men are not actually speaking out about Christianity as like their Lord and Savior. And they're still getting a lot of heat for even talking about morality, Christian morality, but they're not actually Christians themselves. And so it's not the vibe shift that we want. What would you say?
Yeah, I mean, there is some, legitimate people, I think coming to faith. J.D. Vance is a Christian, and we certainly have been seeing statistics that show Gen Z men and things are attending church at higher levels, and that the number of people who have no religious affiliation in America has sort of plateaued. So, Christianity was going like this. Statistically, it's flatlined. There's even some indications people are going up. You're right. And I think one of the things that shows that it is a vibe shift in the culture is that people who aren't believing Christians are now glomming onto it. The thing that's pretty wild to me is Richard Dawkins, the new atheist philosopher, a philosopher. He's an public intellectual. He basically now calls himself a cultural Christian. He doesn't believe in Christianity, but he sees Christianity as central to the values of Western liberal democratic society that he views as under threat. Yeah. I think some of it has resulted from sort of a politicization. One of the things that happened over the course of the negative world up until last year was the woke revolution, where we saw this hard left turn into sort of racial politics, racial identity politics. We also saw tremendous shifts around sexuality, was sort of, particularly with the trans movement, I think becoming very, very big. And we had, of course, the DEI. We had the BLM riots that were, 5 years ago. We had the COVID shutdowns. And I think one of the things that happened was with Donald Trump's election, particularly with him winning the popular vote, it really opened the door for people to say, all this stuff has gone too far. And we got to restore some sanity to our country. So you even see like a lot of corporations like publicly abandoning DEI. Now here's the nuance I would say. They all still believe in diversity. I like diversity. It's like, no, we're not going to have this, we're not going to empower the most radical elements of our own company to kind of set policy here. We're going to do things that make sense. And so I think there's definitely been a pivot there. And Christianity now, and this is also related to the political polarization by gender that we see emerging among younger people, where men are more conservative and women are especially much more to the left. Young women have moved very far to the left. And so with political polarization, religion is in a sense right-coded. And so I think that partially explains why young men are becoming interested in Christianity, more affiliated with Christianity, and why so many people who aren't Christians still find Christianity of interest is part of this whole kind of nexus of being, on the right politically. Oh, I'm on the right politically. That would mean I'm, going to get religion because you got to have a religion, or you got to have a religion to fight a religion. The woke stuff is a religion, so we have to have a religion. So I think there's some of that. I don't think it's healthy for Christianity to become kind of politically or coded by gender. I've been critical a long time. I think for certain, probably 200 years, Christianity was extremely female centric, and I think evangelicalism has really revolved around, in essence, the interest of women implicitly. Just as one example, the radio network K-Love, the woman that their prototype, their audience avatar is like a 30-something evangelical minivan driving mom, Christian mom. So like the idea that this is our customer and this is who we're orienting around. I think it's going to be really dislocating when all the people in the pews are men, and particularly when they're sort of pre-catechized by Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson and all these people coming in. So I think it was a mistake to have been overly female-centric in approach, but I don't think the answer to that is to flip to being male-centric. I think we don't want to gender code Christianity, but there is some interesting stuff going on in the culture. What I would say is, I think there's less overt hostility and negativity to Christianity today. However, there's still some. So I don't know all the details of these cases, but there was a church group that held an event in a park in Seattle last week, and they were attacked by a Antifa-backed group of counter protesters. And yes, the Antifa people actually were arrested this time, but the mayor criticized the church people. These, hateful people should not be holding events in this, neighborhood. So the idea that, the mayor's basically like openly criticizing the church group there. And there was also someone whose name escapes me who was fired from the Kennedy Center, Trump appointee to the Kennedy Center, because they didn't like his positions on LGBT. So I think, if you merely, and this is why I always say skepticism is maybe better than negativity, although it doesn't flow quite as well in the framework, because merely identifying as a Christian does not necessarily get you in trouble. Certainly today gets you in less trouble than it would have 5 years ago. But the contents of your Christianity cannot conflict with the new moral order of society. So if you decide, for example, to try to start promoting an abortion ban in the state legislature, you're going to see some blowback. And the culture is definitively post-Christian in a sense. Every time abortion's been on the ballot, the pro-abortion position has won a majority of the vote. Look at gambling, which over the course of the negative world has just become completely normalized in our society. Look at the move towards pot legalization, would be another one. So there's a lot of things I think that show, some of the old cultural and, not all of it was moral, but some of it was moral, some of it was cultural sort of influences of, Protestant Christianity in America have sort of dissipated. I mean, we don't even really have the Protestant work ethic anymore. I see these, I'm not on TikTok, but the TikTok videos are reposted everywhere. So I'll see on Twitter, some 20-something woman with a professional job who's sort of crying over how she hates to go to the office from 9 to 5 every day. And it's not just women, basically Gen Z apparently hates the idea of having like a regular job you have to show up to every day, even if it's only 40 hours. And so they would rather
quiet quitting.
Yeah, it's like I know somebody did some consulting work, economic development consulting work in one Indiana community where there was this factory that was unionized and paid $90,000 a year with full benefits and had trouble recruiting people to work there because the young people don't want to work in a factory. They want to drive DoorDash. They would rather drive DoorDash than have what in the past would have been considered the ultimate steady job because they want to control their schedule and they don't want to have a boss. And so, I think there's been a complete shift in the culture. And so, just because some people are there's some more Christian friendly things going on, let's not kid ourselves about the reality of the culture in America.
Perfectly said. And I would just stack on top of this. I think the cultural acceptance, the cultural vibe shift comes from a false perception of who Jesus and Christianity really is because we've softened the blow so much that they think they understand Christianity. They think they understand the gospel and who Jesus was. And then you even dig in a tiny bit and they have this very different perception of the Jesus that hopefully me and you know. They have this very accepting. He was a cultural rebel of the time. He was very loving. He was accepting. He was hanging out with sinners and prostitutes. And so I'll even go anecdotally. I had 2 conversations, gospel-centered conversations with non-believers this past week. And it was I'm just still reflecting on it and it was just a joy. But one was at a coffee shop and one was at a networking event. One was this investor who just literally studies business sheets all day long. And he tries to find very neat, like a Warren Buffett, but like a caramel type of guy. Long hair, man bun, super long beard, gray, and just is very, he'll just sit and reflect in the coffee shop. I've seen him a couple times. We had an hour and a half conversation about Jesus. So he grew up in the church. He's traveled quite a bit. And one of the first things that he says was, man, Jesus is an awesome guy. You're a Christian. That's amazing. I love Jesus. He's so cool. After an hour and a half of digging into that, he had completely created his own Jesus. I don't know where he was coming up with this information, but he had never really been pushed back on who the true Jesus was. And so, of course, if you can create your own Jesus, or you have this Jesus that maybe the mainlines are painting as this, you have the gay flag outside, you have people who are totally fine with abortion. And then my second one was a networking event. 35-year-old guy from Boston. He was gay, super liberal. We had an hour and a half conversation, maybe one of the most fun conversations I've had in a long time. Justin and Kevin, if you're listening, hello. And the exact same thing. He was talking about how much he loved Jesus, that it was totally awesome that I was into Christianity, that I was in ministry for a while, and he was totally accepting in that. But then when I started to push a little bit about who he thought Jesus was, he had created his whole own Jesus, and he every once in a while attends a church that matches the most with the Jesus that he already contends with. And yeah, if I was to tell him to go to an actual functional church, they would never accept me. Like I want my church to go LGBTQ and all that stuff. And so it's easy for the culture to accept Christianity and the Jesus that they think they know. But I think it's been the biggest problem with the church is that we've allowed that to happen. And we've created so many spaces where people can walk in and not have to be challenged in their beliefs, but walk in their own sin and walk in the perceptions that they have of Jesus, and no one actually confront them about the Jesus that actually exists.
Jesus is an interesting character in the Bible, and there was a guy who wrote a pastor, can't remember his first name, his last name was Ortberg. He was the pastor at Menlo Park Presbyterian. I think he wrote the book, it's called Who Is This Man? About Jesus. And it's like, basically, and one of the points he makes is like all the massive diversity of people who have identified with Jesus and with Christianity. And I do think, in a sense, it's difficult to really construct a Christianity simply based on looking at the life of Jesus, because you can find almost anything you want in there. If you're a pacifist, you can talk about turning the other cheeks. Or if you want a more kind of aggressive approach, you talk about Jesus cleansing the temple, right? And so there's a lot, there's different things that I think you can kind of find what you want a little bit in looking at his character, which is why, the Bible is like more than just, the gospel stories of what Jesus did. And, there's always, the church has always had this kind of tradition that is, here's how we've understood the faith. Something like, the Council of Nicaea, for example, that's like, oh, here's how we understand the nature of God and the Trinity and things of that nature. I think I think people, often people find what they want, but again, we should, Paul, talked about that in I think it's 2 Timothy, people will accumulate, teachers for themselves who'll tickle their ears and tell them what they want to hear. I mean, nothing's new there. And what I think I always say we should do is, it's very easy to look at people, I think, out in the world and say, well, they're this, they're that. It's a lot harder to reflect on the church itself and say, oh, what do we not have right? Why do we think we've got it all right? And, I read a lot about history, and I always read about what was Protestant culture like in the past. So the most famous book on that is Max Weber's The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. But, I've also read many other people who talk about it, even like, the sociologist James Davison Hunter's new book, Democracy and Solidarity. He's talking about the historic Protestant, ethos of, America. And I'm like, wow, that's not us. That doesn't sound like us at all. So I think that, we have to be willing to, consider our own ways, not just consider other people's ways. And so I think it's way too easy. I'm a pretty smart guy, and I've studied a lot of things. And there are many things that I'm uncertain about. I don't think I have the answers to. Every time I learn more, I become less confident. Like that I didn't think about that, I didn't think about that. And there's way too many people, in my view, who are way too certain that they've got it right. When I can say, well, I think you've got it wrong here, 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 and here, and you didn't even think about this stuff. So I think it's easy. It's easy to think about other people, but I think we should also kind of reflect on the church itself, as well.
you said something back in there about you don't think the church should be gender central, like it shouldn't pick one or the other. I want to build up into this because I, in some form or fashion, think you're wrong. Because I do think the church has prioritized women, and there's been a lot of talk about it becoming more feminized over time, and that a maybe disagreeable man or a traditionally masculine man wouldn't find much peace or much just welcome as that kind of man if they walked into a modern Protestant non-denominational church. And so I kind of want to reflect on the feminization of it as a plan for the negative world. Let's talk about some, you came up with some observations of what you saw in each form of the positive, neutral, and negative world. Let's talk about what were the strategies of negative or positive world, what were the strategies of neutral world, and then what are some recommendations that we have come across since your book has come out about what we should do in neutral world.
Negative world, yeah.
Negative world.
So I sort of, in addition to these three worlds, I identify three primary evangelical strategies for engaging with cultural moment. Two from the positive world, one from the neutral world. The positive world strategies were culture war and seeker sensitivity, and the neutral world strategy was cultural engagement. So culture war is basically the religious right. You know, people like Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, they saw the culture going a direction they didn't like. And so their idea is, well, let's mobilize politically to fight back, take back the culture. You know, prior to that, evangelicals had not been especially politically active. And in fact, many of them were Democrats, certainly in the South. And of course, the religious right is still with us today. The seeker sensitivity movement also started in the 1970s led by people like Bill Hybels at Willow Creek Church or Rick Warren at Saddleback Church in the early 80s. And this is the, kind of non-denominational suburban megachurch movement. I mean, some of them have denominations, but it's really what you think of as a non-denominational. It's the megachurch. And what these guys saw, what Bill Hybels saw was people aren't going to church. So he's like, well, why is that? So the origin story of Willow Creek is he went door to door in suburban Chicago, knocking on doors, asking people, why don't you go to church? And as he said, I got an earful. So it's like, I'm going to design a church that they'll go to. So we're going to get rid of stodgy choir robes and hymns and all this stuff. And we're going to have topical therapeutic sermons, informality, contemporary music, relevance. We're not going to beg for money all the time, all this stuff. And it was enormously successful. And you can think of it as a somewhat consumer-oriented Christianity. Again, still with us and in many respects, the dominant strain of evangelicalism today. In the 1990s, in the neutral world, we saw the emergence of a third strategy called cultural engagement, which you can pioneered by people like Tim Keller at Redeemer Presbyterian Church. But also the emerging church movement would have been part of this. And basically, I think there's a couple ways to conceptualize this. One is as a seeker sensitivity for the cities, whereas seeker sensitivity was really about the suburban environment. Cultural engagement was much more about the urban centers that were coming back in that era. The second one is the opposite of the culture war. Rather than fighting with people all the time, they're like, why don't we take advantage of this pluralistic public square to have a conversation with people? And so that was sort of developed there. A little more intellectual, much more attuned to sort of the cultural ethos of urban areas. And I would say also somewhat consumeristic. As we get to the negative world, there really hasn't been a strategy that's really emerged for that. The one thing that was proposed was Rod Dreher's Benedict Option, which was by and large rejected by people at the time, although I think people are paying attention to it now. I don't really have a strategy that I think is
compelling.
Here's what you ought to do 100%. About 3/4 of my book is starter ideas for it. And there probably won't just be one or two models that get hot and everybody does it. It's a much more heterogeneous country. Culturally, there's a huge difference between Manhattan and suburban Indianapolis. So I think that we need to, it's going to be a lot of experimentation. And it's probably going to be new generation leaders, right? If you look at the previous strategy, they were not created by old leaders who retooled what they were doing for a new era. They were created by new leaders. So I think there will be entrepreneurial new people coming up that are going to figure out how to reach Gen Z, They're going to figure out how to reach men. They're going to do different things. And so I don't know what it looks like yet, but I think, at some point we'll come up with something.
Do you see the seeker sensitive model swinging back into negative world? Because you talked about building that model of not hymns. That model seems more prevalent than ever now. Do you see people swinging back to that?
There's definitely been a move towards more formality and liturgy in some respects, but mostly not in the seeker-sensitive world. It's more what I would call the cultural engagement people. It's upper middle class elites who work in Washington, D.C. or New York or places like that, and they want to go to an Anglican church or something like that, and they want the formality and the tradition and the smells and bells and all of that. So there's certainly some of that. I think things have become more liturgical in a sense, but I don't see that necessarily in the megachurches. I do think the megachurches are adapting. I think the megachurch pastors are very, very good at understanding like what's reaching people, and so I think there's a lot of discussions going on, and people are. And I think one of the things that this time rewards is much more clarity. And so I think that they're going to speak more clearly on things, maybe whereas in the past people would have nuanced stuff. But that model is still alive and well. I mean, Indianapolis religious landscape is dominated by megachurches, and just the structural dynamics of church today suggest that we're going to continue seeing more and more consolidation into megachurches as more and more smaller churches essentially go out of business. Or they're not going to be sustainable financially and demographically. And the truth is, the large, everything about kind of modern society rewards things that have enough scale to do things. So we attend a megachurch, and why is that? It's because they have specific ministries that serve the particular needs of our son, and that's something that is typically not present in smaller churches. And so they've got a lot, they're able to sustain large scale ministries to do these things. So I don't see that dying, but I do see like there is sort of a turnover in that as well. I mean, if you go back and look at even in Indianapolis, you can look at mega churches that were prominent or big churches, suburban churches that were prominent 20, 30 years ago. They've fallen off. And if you go visit them, they're starting to get what I call mainline disease. They're skewing older. They don't have as many families with kids. Not as many people attend there. You can tell that the style is not as relevant as it used to be. And now it's the shiny new megachurch, right? So like for a time, it was like, we want to have like one massive campus and everything. Now it's multi-site. So all these different models. And so I do think there's kind of turnover in that. And I think that's one of the challenges of sort of Protestantism is its inability to create things that are sustainable multi-generationally. But, we'll see. But I'm not predicting the imminent death of the megachurch by any means.
Yeah. And I want to stack on top of that, 80 to 90% of church growth, quote unquote, is church hopping. 20% of people change churches annually. So every single year they're trying out a new church until they find exactly their preference, or they just walk away completely. That's why even though we see these huge congregations, church attendance overall is skyrocketing down. It seems like they're sucking up all these smaller churches. They come to this mega church. They don't feel fulfilled. And so they keep hopping around until eventually they stop going altogether. It seems like if you track the data, that's kind of the process that's happening. And what stinks about that the most is because it's so large. And the couple things that you brought up in the business world is happening in the Christian world is, the process of transitioning into a new pastor is not super well because the leader is not kind of well enough to have this like cult following. Most of the time, these like megachurch pastors, they're so good. They're so charismatic. They have such like a hold on the congregation that to think about having a new person just doesn't have the vibrato, so to speak. And then now that they're doing all these satellite campuses, what would have been younger generations taking on the church plant it's just a screen. And so the younger guys don't have a position to actually step in as a pastor, to teach, to lead. I think they have like campus pastors, but everyone knows the main guy on the screen, like as the pastor number one. And so again, taking away those leadership opportunities, those risk, failures, feedback loops from even Christian young guys who are passionate about ministry, but now they can't really start a church because they can't compete with the big church down the street.
One thing I'd say though is, Gen Z people are not going into church planning like they used to. That's one of the things that we've seen. I've heard this from multiple sources that are very different.
Yeah, I watched your podcast with Tyson.
Yeah, so like from millennials, it's like I want to plant a church. For Gen Z, it's I want to become an influencer. Different model. There's widely perceived that there's a shortage of high quality pastor candidates in a lot of places. Which I think is one reason these churches are not going to make it, because the smaller churches can't afford to pay to get a pastor. So I do think if you are a young guy who's thinking about becoming a pastor, I do think there are opportunities. I do think there are opportunities. Maybe it's just not in the mega church structure there. But like, a lot of these seminaries are way down in enrollment. And to the extent that they've kept their enrollment up, it's people getting like counseling MAs and things like that. So I don't think it's as bleak for young generations getting opportunity there. But certainly the mega church model that you've described is a sort of market reality, and that's part of. My friend has got a great line. He's like, the market doesn't care what I think, and there is a sense it's like, yes, we, I don't like this, that, or the other aspect of modern society. We should be more like this. But is there any market for this? And so obviously, Christianity cannot simply be anything you want it to be in order to achieve market share. Maybe we've done too much of that. But I think there is a sense in which, the style of church, the size of church, many of these things, the market is going to drive certain things. And if you want to push against that, you better hope that there's an unserved market.
Yep.
Or otherwise, it's going to fail. And there are a lot of churches that are very traditional that are going out of business because they're all old people and nobody wants to go there anymore. And so I do think we have to recognize that like people are not doing these things in a vacuum because they somehow thought, oh, wow, this is like exactly the way it's supposed to be. They're responding to the market. They're like, okay, we want to reach people for Christ or whatever. How do we do that? How do we reach people today? And so they're looking at like what's going to work. And so I think you could take that too far, but I also think it's like there's sort of an inevitability to that when we are in a place where like we don't have a state church. So for example, Mormonism is in a much stronger position because they're a sect that has its own theology. So it's not like if you're actually a Mormon, you can't go to the Baptist church across the street, and so you could become Baptist. You could go to mainstream Christianity, but they're much more like the Catholic Church in that it's a centralized hierarchical organization where there aren't a lot of schismatic groups that have achieved scale. In American Protestantism, there's thousands of churches. You just go pick the one that's right for you, and we're never going to create an integrated structure where it'll stop the church hopping problem. People are going to go where they want to find, and there's kind of no way, to stop them in a sense. Whereas I think, like even like Eastern Orthodoxy, there's all these different churches, but they're all doing the exact same thing. It might be in a different language, it might have a slightly different architecture, but it's like, here's the liturgy. It hasn't changed in over 1,000 years, and this is what we're going to do. And so, in a sense, I do think that the nature of sort of fragmented Protestantism, especially in America, creates an environment that's very challenging. It's like I want to push back against this, and so I think this is a conundrum that has faced American religion for a very, very long time. Do you try to have a church that is very pure and therefore is very small? You can maybe think of people who have a sort of Presbyterian confessionalist idea. I want us to be very solid Westminster Confession people, and we're going to do church like the Reforms say you should do church. We're not going to have any. We're going to do this. And there are denominations like that, and there are individual churches like that, but it's a very small number of people. Or do you want to, reach? Do you want to grow and reach people at the cost of having to water some things down or be more shallow? And Charles Taylor in A Secular Age talks about that. He calls it the dilemma of renunciation. And it's a big challenge. It's a big challenge. I mean, his dilemma of renunciation is slightly different, but it's very similar. How high a bar do you set that you want to make people cross over? You set it high, you can feel good that you're doing everything 100%, whatever. If you set it low, but that nobody's going to get in. Right? And so, again, what's the right thing? What I love about there's an old church catechism called the Didache. And if you've ever heard of it, it was made date to the 1st century. It's basically the oldest catechism of the church. Yep. One of the things it says is like, you should do this, this, this. Like, here's like 50 things you need to be doing. And then like the last line of that section is, if you can't do all of this, do what you can. And I thought that was like, do what you can. Like it. But I do think that's like, those are the sorts of things that, it's very easy to say, well, we just need to do this. I do think we need to, there are legitimate trade-offs to be making. And again, I'm not the theologian, so what's the theology of all of this?
Yeah.
But I mean, also keep in mind, historically, the belief in the West certainly was very, very few people are actually saved. The number of people who are going to heaven is tiny, and the number of people who are going to hell is very large. So part of it is, if you adopt this more puristic model, what you're basically saying is the vast majority of people are destined to hell. And of course, in America, that's changed. There's a very famous Roman Catholic sermon called something like "On the Fewness of the Saved." And it's basically like, almost, if you're not a saint, you're not getting in. And so it's like there is this kind of sense that like a lot of this comes down to how many people do you think are among the elect? I don't think the Bible gives us like an explicit answer, but there is a lot of stuff like, the way is narrow and few are those who find it. The way is broad that leads to destruction. That do incline you towards thinking it's a small number, but we don't. It's one of those things where the answer that you implicitly have, even if you've never thought about it, informs so much of what you do. Right? If you think potentially almost everyone is going to be able to get into to heaven, if you will, then you're going to be like, let's get them in the door, say the prayer, and do that. If you think, well, it's like 5% or less are getting in, you're going to be like, man, we have to be ultra demanding. And again, Protestantism has a challenge here too, in that the Catholic Church, sort of one of the ways they solved the problem, if you want to call it that, is they created a 2-tier structure. So there's people who are in religious vocations, the monks, the priests, etc. There's super Christians. We have super Christians here. And then we just understand that there's like, kind of like lower grade Christians down here. As Protestantism said, no, we're not going to do that. It's going to be like one. But the problem with the one is you end up like, how much can you demand from the one group? The Catholics created a tiered system. There's kind of the entry level, and then you can like sign up to be a super Christian kind of thing. And so it's hard. When you start thinking about it that way, raises a lot of questions.
It does. And I've never heard it spoken like that, of which one do you think, like, is there more people getting into heaven, and if there's not? And that probably actually translates into your eschatology almost. Right. And I guess I would have to say that I would believe that less people are getting in, and that we should take church more seriously, rather than everyone's getting in on this cultural Christianity. They're living exactly how they want, and just because there's 12,000 people in this sanctuary that come on a Sunday morning does not mean a lot of these people are getting into heaven. I think probably the opposite, because they're not being convicted with the truth, or like having some type of accountability of how. Because in my opinion, if you study the New Testament, I think it paints a very like vivid picture of how your life should look and how your heart should look, your desire for the Lord in progressing in holiness, progressing in sanctification, progressing in spiritual disciplines. Like, you should want to do those things. You should seek to do those things. And if those things are not a desire for you, then it might not mean you were transformed and the Holy Spirit lives inside of you. If you could still live the exact life that you were living beforehand, except you just go to church for an hour on Sunday, like, to me, I think that's doing people a disservice. And I don't know, like, maybe it's just because I believe the road is truly narrow and like God meant that. But when I look at Jesus's ministry, I mean, by the time he goes up, I think there's it says 40 to 100 disciples that are hearing his last teachings. Okay. And so I truly believe that it does paint a more strict picture of the church, and I'm okay with that. I do want to go back to what you said about.
I want one comment on that. I think you go back to the 50s. In the sort of the Christian normative society, or even the positive world, when there was sort of a normative expectation in society that being in church, being a member of a church is part of what it means to be a good citizen. It's kind of expected that everybody go to church. Then there has to be a place in the pew for everybody. You can't really make too many demands when you're expecting most people. Everybody's kind of expected to be in. But as Christianity becomes, decoupled from citizenship, and we know it's going to be a minority and not everybody's going to want it, that does free the church to think about, we can maybe raise the bar a little bit. That's one thing I would say.
My conclusion would be like, not lowering the bar so low where most people can get over it, but having some sort of that. And you talked about kind of men not, like there not being a lack of leadership or people that aren't. I went to seminary. I was in ministry for a long time, and I simply got disenchanted with it. Once I saw behind the curtain of what the church was prioritizing, I couldn't unsee it. And what I would see in scripture, and this was definitely me being young and just reckless, so to speak, but like being someone who asks questions or a disagreeable type of person does not fit well in the modern church context. And like you said, like you can go to that younger or that older church that has been around a while, but you're probably going to be one of the younger people in there. But if you go to one of these mega churches and who has that non-denominational formula that we're talking about, they're pretty much sailing, like they're straight going. But it seems like my generation doesn't really want to partake in that, but we don't know where we fit in. And so maybe you do have to kind of take that risk of, I think we talked about it over coffee one time, of like to actually be a functional church, to actually like maybe have some elders, have a pastor on. You need about 500 to 800 people to kind of pay the rent, to pay some staff, to actually get going. And getting to that 500 to 800 mark is really difficult when you're competing with this mega church right down the street. That's right. And I don't know if we should use that as there's some things where capitalism does not work well. In actual competition of lowering the bar does not work well. And I think Christianity is the prime example of competition should not be available in the Protestant space, because that just circles down. Like what does supply and demand do? It plummets the price. It plummets the value. Like maybe the value goes up, so the production goes up, but the actual price of it goes down. And so it's
like I said, the market doesn't care what I think.
Yeah.
The market doesn't care about truth. The market cares about supply and demand.
And how do you do that in a church context that's not institutionalized? So that's where the Catholic Church and what you said, the Mormon Church, they can get away from it a little bit. But because Protestants are so divided, do you see any type of institutionalizing of where the non-denominational church would ever come together and kind of put a halt on trying to compete with one another, but saying, hey, we're going to raise the bar a little bit and let's not try to go to the lowest common denominator and make it so low that most of these people they're not even Christians? Like, do you think that's ever going to happen?
No.
And what do we just let this thing keep breaking apart until millennia?
Yeah, I don't know what's going to happen, to be quite honest.
That's the question. And
we're living in conditions of uncertainty.